In 1858, a message between America and Europe still travelled at the speed of wind and sail. 10 days on a good crossing, 3 weeks in bad weather, long enough for markets to collapse, treaties to fail, and wars to escalate before instructions arrived. Bankers traded on outdated prices, generals fought without guidance. Governments ruled distant territories with weeks-old information. The entire world ran on delay. The Atlantic Ocean did not just separate continents, it separated decisions from consequences. Then, in the middle of the 19th century, one man decided the ocean itself should no longer matter. Not faster ships, not better navigation, a wire. Cyrus Field believed delay itself was the problem. His solution sounded impossible. Stretch a living cable across the ocean floor and send electricity through 2,000 miles of crushing depth, violent storms, and fragile insulation. Engineers said it would fail. Investors feared ruin. Each broken attempt burned money, credibility, and time. But if the cable worked, communication would move faster than ships for the first time in human history. And once that happened, the world would never again feel as large as it did before. Field did not begin as a scientist or a sailor or a government man. He began as something more dangerous to the established order, a private citizen with money, time, and the kind of confidence that comes from winning early. By his mid-30s, he had already made a fortune in business and stepped away, effectively retired while most men were still climbing. That retirement did not turn him quiet, it turned him restless. In that restlessness, he found a problem that looked like fate. Messages could race along wires on land, but the ocean still forced every decision to wait. The telegraph had accelerated continents. The Atlantic kept the old speed limit in place. If someone could push a line under the sea, the speed limit would vanish. It is easy now to hear that and assume institutions would naturally do it. Governments, navies, big companies. But the mid-19th century did not have a single global communications authority. There was no one office responsible for shrinking the planet. The system was fractured. Private capital had to be convinced, and private capital hated uncertainty. That is where Field's gamble begins. He had enough personal credibility to open doors, but not enough to pay for the entire ocean. The cable would require factories, ships, crews, and constant resupply. Above all, it would require patience from investors for a project that could fail invisibly, a mile beneath the waves, with nothing to show but a balance sheet of sunk costs. So Field did what the era demanded. He built a company and tried to sell the future. In 1856, in London, he helped form the Atlantic Telegraph Company. The decision to incorporate there was not just geographic convenience. Britain was the centre of finance, and any cable that touched Ireland would need British cooperation. This was a political and financial bridge as much as an engineering one. A transatlantic cable would not be laid by optimism. It would be laid by contracts, subscriptions, and promises that survived bad headlines. Those promises would be tested almost immediately. Because the antagonist in this story is not a rival tycoon. It is not a foreign government. It is the ocean itself, and the physics that the ocean enforces without negotiation. The Atlantic looks empty from the deck of a ship. It looks like a surface you cross. But for a cable, the surface is irrelevant. What matters is the abyss below, depth that multiplies weight and tension, and currents and storms that turn a controlled payout into a fight for balance. A cable is not simply dropped, it is paid out, fed steadily from a ship, while the ship stays on course, while the line remains unbroken, while the insulation stays intact, while the tension does not rise past the point of snapping. Every one of those variables is unstable, and the deeper the water, the less room you have for error. The 1857 expedition was the first major confrontation with that reality. The plan was bold but straightforward. Carry the cable out into the Atlantic and lay it across. In practice, the sea made every moment a negotiation with gravity. As the cable ran out behind the ship, it was being pulled down by its own weight into depths no one could see. If the ship moved too fast or a swell jerked the line, Tension spiked. If the tension spiked too far, the cable did not complain. It simply parted. And it did. During payout, the cable snapped. That break was more than a mechanical failure. It was a message to every investor watching from shore. The ocean does not care how much you raised in London. The laws of physics do not respect your schedule. In a financing system built on confidence, a visible failure is expensive, but an invisible failure, somewhere under miles of water, is catastrophic. There is no dramatic wreck to salvage, no tangible object to display. The money is gone, and so is the proof that it was ever close. For Field, this is where the documentary question sharpens. What kind of person sees that first failure and continues, not with government backing guaranteed, not with certainty, but with the knowledge that each attempt will be harder to fund than the last? Part of the answer is personality. Field had made his fortune by making decisive bets, and he was willing to risk not only money, but reputation. But another part is structural. The world had become dependent on speed in every place, except the ocean crossing. Business and politics were accelerating, and the Atlantic delay was becoming less tolerable every year. The incentive grew as the difficulty remained constant. That gap between rising demand and stubborn physics creates obsession. So the work continued. More cable, more planning, more persuading. By 1858, the pressure was higher. Each new subscription had to overcome the memory of the last break. Field and his partners were no longer selling a dream. They were selling a second chance, and the world is less generous with those. When the cable failed again early in 1858, the situation turned desperate. Desperation is often where innovation hides. Not the clean, lab-tested kind, but the improvised kind that emerges when there is no time left to be careful. They tried again with a method that acknowledged the central risk. The longer the cable stayed vulnerable at sea, the more chances it had to fail. The solution was to splice cable in mid-ocean, joining sections together out on the water, and then send two ships in opposite directions, each racing toward land. The logic was simple. The cable could fail at any time, so reduce the time it spends at maximum risk, split the distance, turn one long ordeal into two shorter ones, and hope the cable survives both. Splicing in mid-ocean is the kind of act that sounds routine only after it becomes routine. At the time, it was an admission that the project had moved beyond neat planning. It was now a struggle of endurance, of crews handling heavy, delicate material, while the deck rose and fell beneath their feet, while the future of the company rode on whether the splice held and the payout remained smooth. This is also where the cable stops being an object and becomes a system. A telegraph line is not only copper and insulation, it is signal strength, the ability of an electric pulse to travel distance without dissolving into noise. It is the discipline of operators reading faint patterns accurately. It is insulation resisting salt water day after day. It is coordination between ships, between stations on shore, between financiers who must keep paying before the first message earns a penny. When it works, it looks like magic. When it fails, it looks like nothing. And then on August 5th, 1858, the line finally connected Valentia Island to Trinity Bay, Newfoundland. The geography matters because it reveals the logic of the route. These were edges of the Atlantic world, places where land reaches out, as if trying to close the gap itself. On that day, the ocean that had enforced silence became a medium. The floor of the Atlantic, previously irrelevant to human affairs, now carried human intention. For the first time in history, a message could cross the Atlantic faster than a ship. It is difficult to convey what that meant to people who had spent their whole lives assuming delay was natural. A letter to Europe was a decision sent into the future, arriving after the world had already changed. News was always late. Orders were always stale. Now, suddenly, an event in one continent could be known in the other before the week was out, before the weather changed, before markets had time to invent their own rumours, before diplomats had time to stall. But a breakthrough is not the same as stability. The early cable's performance was fragile, and the system around it was under strain. Signals over such distance were weak and difficult. Every message was an act of careful interpretation. The cable itself had survived the lay, but survival was not the end of the ocean's testing. Still, the moment was real enough to produce a ceremonial proof. Authority speaking through the wire. 11 days after the connection, Queen Victoria sent a message to President Buchanan. It was formal, deliberate, and heavy with meaning because it was not just a greeting, it was a demonstration. For centuries, diplomacy across the Atlantic had been a conversation with long pauses. A letter could be drafted, sealed, shipped, received, answered, and shipped back, and the entire exchange could span months. Months in which the political situation might shift beneath it. The Victoria to Buchanan message suggested something new. Dialogue without the ocean's delay, power speaking at the speed of electricity. This is the part that feels, in hindsight, like an early internet moment. Not because the cable carried the everyday chatter of millions, it did not, but because people could suddenly imagine a world where distance was no longer the main obstacle to coordination. The message itself mattered less than the implication behind it. The Atlantic had been crossed by something other than a hull. And yet, an investigative lens has to linger here, because success has a way of hiding cost. Field's triumph was also a lesson in how modern infrastructure is born, not as a single invention, but as a sequence of failures that must be financed through doubt. Every expedition required capital, raised in advance, on faith. Every failure created fresh evidence that faith was misplaced. The cable was not only fighting the ocean, it was fighting the market's memory. Each break did not simply remove a line from the water, it threatened to remove the next line from possibility. Field's role, then, is not only that of a dreamer who pushed a wire under the sea. He becomes a case study in how a private individual can bend history by absorbing risk that institutions refuse to hold, until the day the impossible becomes useful, and then suddenly everyone needs it. Because once even a single message beats a ship, the old world begins to die. Traders can no longer pretend ignorance lasts weeks. Newspapers can no longer live on delay. Governments can no longer tolerate the excuse that instructions are still at sea. A technology does not have to be perfect to be revolutionary. It only has to change expectations. The Atlantic cable did that. It made time itself feel different. It turned the ocean from a barrier into an interval. Before the wire, the Atlantic separated causes from effects. A crash in one market might take days to echo into another. A diplomatic insult might drift for weeks before it landed. Leaders could act and only later learn what they had triggered overseas. After the wire, even in its earliest fragile form, that buffer began to collapse. Actions and consequences moved closer together. The world did not become calmer, it became faster. And that is the lasting consequence of Field's wager. Not merely that he connected Ireland to Newfoundland, but that he proved distance could be engineered away if someone was willing to lose enough times, publicly, expensively, until physics finally gave up a path. Once the Atlantic carried thought at the speed of electricity, the world suddenly felt smaller.